Hey folks, George here again with Philosophy of Law. Today, what we're going to talk about in Philosophy of Law is Ronald Dworkin's theory of law as integrity. Now, we'll recall that the previous two discussions have been about a key question being, how does law work? How does the legal system work? The legal realists said that it works by just the individual biases of, let's say, judges, and that biases influence judges' decisions, and then they rationalize their ideas, right? Well, critical legal studies folks took that a step further and said what really is going on is that there's competing interests that we all have to acknowledge, and we all have to acknowledge the role that the structures of society, that the laws themselves play in forming our interests and forming our ideas about our attitudes towards the law. Ronald Dworkin's going to come here and try to temper some of that, what I've called previously, some of that cynicism of critical legal studies and legal realism. However, Ronald Dworkin is going to recognize the, how could we say, the insights that the legal realists claim and the insights that critical legal studies folks claim, right? Because after all, we can't just dismiss these things outright. They do raise very important points. And so Ronald Dworkin is going to try to find a nice balance between these critical legal studies folks and, on the other hand, these folks like, let's say, the legal positivists who merely say the law is the law. The law is what's written down, right? Ronald Dworkin is going to try to say, let's take an alternate middle road that isn't as conservative nor as cynical as these two extremes. So let's see if we could thread a needle in between these two. So let's see how Ronald Dworkin's law as integrity theory does that. Well, first of all, Ronald Dworkin is going to say that courts and judges have to decide principles. They've all got principles by which they think about certain laws. And that's how these decisions are really made, right? And the principles that jurists and judges and lawyers employ help to guide the system into the future. For example, we can't extend injury compensation to everybody who's not present, to people who are not present at some sort of event. That would just be a little bit too extreme. The principle might be, wait a second, we have to limit injury compensation to people who are actually at a particular event, right? After all, if we extend the principle beyond people who are at some sort of injurious event, then that would produce too many bad consequences. And these are all things that are in the back of the minds of jurists and judges who are deciding important cases. Now, some principles that some judges might want to appeal to just are not justified. He gives an example. For example, one judge might say, yeah, but if we allow this to stand, then it'll congest the courts. Unfortunately, that's not a principle that our legal system, that the American legal system, let's say, would support. And for that reason, judges can't work within that principle. So they've got to use other principles that would work, that would make sense, that would show that the system as a whole has integrity. Integrity, that being the key thing here, that judges are all trying to build, and lawyers are trying to build a system towards a system with integrity. And so the principle of integrity really instructs judges and lawyers to decide what consideration parties are entitled to, right? Part of this to figure out who is entitled to what in different cases is to figure out how to express a coherent system of justice, a coherent conception of justice. And that's really what judges are doing when they make decisions. They're trying to make the whole system of justice make sense in a nice, coherent way with integrity. What does that mean? That means that judges have to give the best constructive interpretation to not only the laws that they're applying, but the case that's before them as well, and how to interpret these laws in a way that creates and constructs a coherent system and with integrity. And so they're applying these rules and trying to construct a story, really, such that the whole legal system, the whole justice system, will be coherent and will make sense and create a conception of justice that is reasonable. They do that by applying certain principles, and they keep certain principles in mind. So then, what are some of these principles? Well, one principle that Ronald Dworkin suggests we use is the principle of stare decisis, or the principle of precedent. What precedents have been set? What that really means is we have to look at history and see how history has led us to the point that we are at today. And how can we utilize that history to create a better story for the cases that are in front of us today? That doesn't mean that they're going to look at all history, right? In American history, for example, there is a history of slavery. How do judges incorporate that into the story to make a system with integrity today? Well, they probably discard laws that supported slavery, for example, but they are going to look at history and see the 14th Amendment and the 13th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, which ultimately these Reconstruction amendments, and say, oh my goodness, this is how we're going to establish a coherent system for today. Now, earlier when I suggested, and when Ronald Dworkin suggested, that this is a system, this law as integrity, this is a philosophy that tries to balance between these two poles, the pole of cynicism given by critical legal studies, and this pole of like ultra-conservatism that says the law is the law, right? That is because we have to recognize that there are terrible conflicts in our society today. There are terrible challenges in our society today, and there are great changes that have been made and that are to be made still, right? There is a constant evolution of our society, and how do we, as an evolving society, every society evolves, every society changes. How do we, in light of the changes that society is making and has made, how do we construct a system with integrity and a coherent system and a coherent story to help all of that make sense, so that the justice system makes sense with the evolving society? And to really explicate this point, Ronald Dworkin gives us an analogy of a chain novel. What does that mean, a chain novel? Well, each judge has to write a new chapter in this novel that's been written throughout history, right? Since the beginning of the American justice system. And each judge, each decision, contributes a new chapter to that novel called the American justice system or the American legal system. Now, when they do write a new chapter in this novel, they can't just write any crazy chapter that they want, right? That would just be absurd. Rather, they're trying to make a novel and complete this chain novel that's been going on for years and years and years, and decades and centuries even, right? They want to make this novel make sense. How do you make this novel make sense? And that's why earlier Ronald Dworkin uses words like integrity and coherence, right? Because there is this long chain novel called the American justice system, the American legal system, right? And judges are trying to make it make sense. Right now, this case in front of me is a new chapter. How does it make sense compared to all the other chapters that have come before? That's the challenge of a judge. Well, the judge applies principles to help make the whole story make sense, and has to tell the best possible story too, right? Well, best possible story based on what? Well, Certainly, there are going to be, and this is where Ronald Dworkin isn't so extreme, and that's what I mean by the middle ground. He recognizes that there are different judges who have different biases and have different interests in mind, as the critical legal studies folks suggest, right? But the story still has to make sense. They can't just make up any old story they want. And by the way, why don't they make up any old story they want? Because judges do take their jobs seriously. And they should take their jobs seriously. You see right there, we see two different aspects of Ronald Dworkin's philosophy. He's not just saying how the legal system does work. He's also throwing in a prescriptive analysis. This is how the legal system should work too. He's doing both at the same time. Indeed, there is this chain novel. Oh, so the metaphor goes, right? This is just a metaphor. There's this chain novel, and judges contribute to the chain novel, right? That's how the system should work. That's how the system does work. And that kind of fits a nice middle ground between these folks who say the law is the law, and these other folks who say, well, the law is just competing interests. Well, Ronald Dworkin again. That's that perfect middle ground that he's walking. However, at the same time, every new chapter doesn't have to fit exactly with all of history. There are obviously going to be conflicts in history, and that's how it's going to go, right? They rather have to make an interpretation of the case that's in front of them. They have to make an interpretation that best fits the whole text. And it's not going to be possible because there's so many cases in the history of the American justice system. There's so many cases that it's going to be impossible to fit it perfectly and be consistent with every single case. But when you look at it as a whole, a certain coherence will emerge, and hopefully the judges can figure out how to make this case fit within that grand coherence. Of course, there's always going to be trade-offs. There's always going to be trade-offs. Why? Because there's always different dimensions of history. Right? But again, it's the interpretation, and judges are tasked with making an interpretation that makes the law as a whole better. Now, there's two examples that I want to give, or one example that I want to give that really fleshes this idea out, and that is the laws of segregation, right? In much earlier in American history, there was a landmark case called Plessy versus Ferguson. I don't want to get into the details right here, but the Plessy versus Ferguson, the ultimate conclusion was that we can segregate government institutions like schools and other things because there can be separate but equal. Now, much later in 1954, there was another landmark case by the Supreme Court called Brown versus the Board of Education, which ultimately looked at that Plessy versus Ferguson case and said, wait a second, when we look at the whole history, we have to make this whole history look coherent. And in fact, there is this Plessy versus Ferguson case. However, to make the whole story work better and be more coherent, we have to dismiss this precedent of separate but equal. Now, legal scholars can show that there was gradual steps to that story that slowly dissolved the separate but equal principle until ultimately Brown versus Board of Education completely eliminated the principle of separate but equal, right? And that's one great example of how this chain novel law as integrity approach to how is the law applied? How does the law work, right? This is how it works. We see these different cases, and then we try to build a coherent story, right? And sometimes there are these parts that really stick out, like Plessy versus Ferguson, and like separate but equal. But then later on, the justices can make a law, or rather interpret the law in such a way that says, wait, this part back here really isn't coherent with the whole justice system. Therefore, we shall abolish this principle of separate but equal. And that's exactly what Brown versus the Board of Education did. So that's why I like that example to really flesh out this notion of how the law works, according to Ronald Dworkin. Now, of course, what is an obvious problem that emerges with Ronald Dworkin's philosophy here? Clearly, there's going to be contesting notions, contesting interpretations about what would be the most coherent approach towards all of this, right? Towards this history of American jurisprudence. However, and this is Ronald Dworkin's brilliant insight, yes, of course there's going to be conflicts about how to interpret the law. That doesn't mean, however, that we are justified in taking the extreme interpretation that critical legal studies takes and suggesting that the whole system is therefore meaningless. Yes, there are challenges, there are difficult cases, there are conflicting interpretations. That doesn't mean it's meaningless, though. That doesn't mean it's meaningless, as the skeptics in critical legal studies will have us suppose. Rather, the law as integrity approach, as spelled out by Dworkin here, really provides a better fit and a better justification for the legal practice as a whole. Whereas critical legal studies says it's all nonsense, it's all arbitrary, right? What Ronald Dworkin does is try to remind us and bring back the meaningfulness of it all by saying, yes, there are challenges, but we work through those challenges. After all, we do still have to create a unified society. We do still have to work within a unified community and make a legal system that we can all work with. It seems that critical legal studies almost promotes anarchism, right? And no legal system at all. So Dworkin finds that to be ultra extreme, right? An extreme response to a problem of, yes, there are disagreements. Does disagreement mean that we can't have a system? Dworkin says, of course we can have a system. And of course, many of us want to have a system, right? Because we do live in this community. I'm reminded of Winston Churchill's old argument in favor of democracy. Winston Churchill said something like, well, of course, democracy is the worst form of government ever, except all the rest. What does Winston Churchill mean by that? Well, of course, democracy has all sorts of problems. However, what's the alternative? And that's the position that really Ronald Dworkin is putting forth here, I believe. Or my interpretation of Ronald Dworkin is that, of course, there's going to be terrible challenges and terrible inconsistencies. And of course, there are going to be marginalized groups that are mistreated under the legal system. But what's the alternative? The alternative, according to Dworkin, would be let's work together to lend integrity to the system, to build this system and make it a better system, right? Using principles from history and extend those history to elevate the people who are marginalized today, right? Because the alternative is what? Anarchy? Okay. And by the way, there is that nihilistic approach. By the way, at least that's an honest solution, right? That if you're a critical legal studies person, that is a solution, the nihilism and anarchy. However, for the rest of us who do want to live in society, we do have to come to some sort of understanding and meaningfulness of it all. And Ronald Dworkin's law of integrity does put forward that sort of theory. And by the way, it does rather explain very well, very nicely, how the legal system does work into the future. By the way, Ronald Dworkin again acknowledges that the legal rules isn't everything there is to it. All the laws that are written down, that's not all there is to it. But to counter positivism, who merely says the law is the law as written down, well, of course it's not, because we are human beings, as the realists remind us of. We are human beings, so we're not merely computer programs that implement the law. We are human beings, and we do have flaws, but we do have to interpret things in different ways. This is the best that humans can do if we want a society at all, right? And to counter the skepticism of critical legal studies, again, if you want to live in a society, we are humans. This is the best that humans can do, right? We are going to have flaws, and that's how we do this. How do we do this? By constructing together a coherent system with integrity. He uses the metaphor of a chain novel, but the core ideas are that we have to work together to make a system with integrity, looking at history, and make it coherent, make it make sense in light of these challenges and acknowledging the challenges that are ahead of us. That helps me think about, after especially reading and analyzing the critical legal studies where they say, well, everything is just meaningless, ultimately. I like this, but is this the best humans can do? Might there be another solution? Well, I'm not sure. That's a lot to think about now, especially for those of us who don't want anarchy. Yeah, I think Ronald Dworkin gives us a nice middle ground. See you next time. Bye-bye.